start today's presentation with my slides here. All right. So, what we have for today, let me start with a very brief overview of what we did yesterday because I said yesterday, unfortunately, you were not able to attend, but uh, I told you before that these two first points in the agenda would take a whole session, and that's exactly what happened yesterday. Um, which means we talked a lot about scaffolding, we talked a lot about strategies for teaching no, we were talking about speaking, and we gave a special attention to building confidence and promoting authentic speaking. Um, because well, actually, one of the main points we discussed it was the first one was the difference between guided or sorry between controlled speaking tasks, guided speaking tasks, and free speaking tasks. And one of the main takes I would say from the course we're in now is that we are not trying to say that everything from the past is negative or that we are expected to use one single approach, meaning that we look, over the shoulder, we look and say, to drilling, to repetition, because they are part of the process. The thing is that what we're trying to say here is that we cannot, or we shouldn't, or we must not, depending on your how you think about it, is we cannot stay there, at the level of cognitive demand related to repetition. So, is repetition something we should avoid? Not necessarily. Is repetition supposed to be our main strategy? No. You see, that's the difference. Especially talking about cognitive demand, that's something that depends on the level. It is very difficult to have free speaking tasks with newcomers. That's a fact. Like how do you expect them to have a conversation if they don't have the skills, if they don't have the vocabulary, for instance? And this is uh, basically what I mean when I say we shouldn't be demeaning one or favor the other just because they are there and we can use them for our benefit. And that's the essence of the post method era thing we discussed a few days ago. We are the ones that, based on our knowledge and experience, should judge what to do to benefit our students' uh, learning process. That was one of the main points. Then, of course, I would invite you to watch the recording. It's a bit shorter because, of course, I had planned some discussions, short discussions, but they take time. There were two or three of them, which made the recording shorter than usual. Today, as you can see here, we're talking about teaching reading skills. And as I said yesterday, the last point here, developing classroom activities, is not directly addressed. And this is why we haven't seen it with a strike through, because this is like implicit in everything we are discussing regarding skills. So moving on, we have the section header again, developing communicative skills. Today, as I said, we are focusing on reading. And of course, my question for you would be, you can type it in the chat if you want, how you would define reading using your own words. Again, I said even one phrase if you want. How would you define reading if you had to? Okay, Maria has already given us a few words. I think Alba was about to, but something went wrong. And we also have Maria Adams. Reading is a cognitive process where the person identifies meaning in the symbols, words in this case, and it can become more demanding the more complex words are used. Um, this is very interesting because we are already seeing some coincidences in the way we perceive reading. Also, here I'm seeing references to, well, cognitive psychology and or cognitivism. It's better, I think, and linguistics. Um, hmm. Let's see what we have here then. Thank you for your contributions, and let's see how they connect to a very this is not an official definition. This is not taken from an author or anything. This is just me trying to build a very holistic definition of reading. So in this case, I wrote, reading is a dynamic process of constructing meaning from written text shaped by the reader's prior knowledge, context, and purpose. So reading involves decoding symbols, which is a big part of what you guys were including in your definitions, interpreting ideas, and negotiating meaning through interaction with the text. Effective reading then draws from cognitive strategies. Yes, there is a big cognitive component here because in the end it's happening there. But as we have said regarding other topics in the past, the thing with cognitive views or views that are too closely or too narrowly connected to cognitivism, they leave aside the social aspect of everything that's going on. And remember, even if we look at this from the second language acquisition perspective, or let's say from our EFO perspective, we have gone from learning being a process of building habits, the behavioral approach. Then we had the cognitive era, especially starting after Noam Chomsky's contributions to the field. And then we had the famous social turn in the last part of the 20th century. Uh, that includes, well, what the word indicates, the social aspect of everything we're discussing here. And this is why it says here that effective reading um, draws cognitive strategies. Yes, because there is a mental process here, but there is also cultural awareness. And the ability, this is again your brain at work, the ability to evaluate, synthesize, respond to information in ways that are personally and socially relevant. So what we're basically saying here is that reading is indeed a cognitive process, but a cognitive process that transcends itself, something that becomes not just an individual cognitive practice, but that becomes a social practice that allows us to make meaning out of a written code, to go beyond the linguistic thing, as Ferdinand de Saussure when he talked about signo lingüístico, lingüística general en la ULA, la profesora Pamela Pan, saludos donde esté. So talking about reading, again, thank you guys for giving me this starting point. Talking about reading, I'm going to ask you to reflect a little more on the topic after my contribution there with my definition. Think back to a time when reading felt this. Yes, this is all negative. When reading felt frustrating, confusing, or even meaningless. And this might have happened at school, at university, or at a professional development activity. Maybe you can say something we have done here. This is a professional development activity as well. So again, think back to a time when reading felt bad, either frustrating, confusing, or meaningless. Okay. So you can consider the following questions. What made it difficult? What made it frustrating? What made it confusing or meaningless? Uh, for example, was it the text that made it difficult? Was it the text that made it meaningless? Was it the task itself? Was it the teacher? Maybe the teacher made it look boring. right away? Or was it something else? Was it your, I don't know, this is just to give you an example. Was it that the topic was particularly uh, sensitive for you, for instance? After this, you will consider the teaching choices that contributed. So this is you using your critical thinking, basically. You are trying to come up here with an explanation to why these teaching choices, so the decisions made by the teacher, not you, caused the struggle you faced. Then, again, this is a critical thinking exercise. You are asking yourself, what could have helped you more deeply or confidently with this material, with this text? And how does that experience shape the way you teach or see the way you teach reading today or the way you see, perceive reading nowadays? So I'm going to give you a little more here, maybe 3, 4 minutes. Or I think there's already an answer here. Um, okay, so Maria, I'm gonna ask you to expand the idea so we can discuss them. This is what I mean when I said I'm gonna even turn off my camera for a moment so you have time to think. And especially the second part would be probably the most challenging here. So again, take a moment and we'll discuss them. So guys, who has something to share here to answer the questions? Again, we're trying to talk about time in the past where each one of us separately found reading activity to be difficult. We are considering the possible reasons, and then we are moving on to possible explanations and solutions. Um, okay, for me, I would say maybe university. I would sometimes struggle to understand certain texts because the context in which they were used alter their definition. That would make me feel confused. It would have helped me. My teacher had told us in advance that was going to be a thing and explain to us what the authors meant. This is a very useful example, Maria. Thank you very much. This is really, really useful to what we will be discussing in a moment. Does anybody else want to contribute with an experience? I can give you a couple of seconds, maybe. If not, we can move on because either way is the example. Even you can even drop the example there in the chat because we will be discussing this. Well, this is today's main topic. And as I said, you can check the chat because that example takes us already to the first part we will be discussing based on this very short reflection. We talking about challenges here. Some very common challenges we find, uh, and to get there, we have this question. Okay? It says this is asking what makes reading hard for our learners, especially in English, and take a moment to think of cognitive, emotional, and contextual factors. So, if you consider again the example I just read, we are talking about cognitive, we're talking about lack of guidance, and you should consider where that's taking you. The lack of guidance is affecting you probably in more than one way. And Maria even mentioned specifically the lack of contextualization of the content. That's already a big issue since we have seen this. Actually, we have seen this in previous sessions. The importance of the context, the importance of contextual factors, and we even we have even talked, we have even mentioned, we have even made reference to context sensitive pedagogy. So probably this was an issue in that case, and probably this is a very common issue we have seen in the past in our experience, and both as learners and as teachers. Limited vocabulary or limited background knowledge regarding the topic in discussion. Um, how are you supposed to understand a text if you don't understand most of the words you are finding there? You can look at it the other way around, of course. You can ask, okay, but if we have reading strategies, I didn't even include them in today's discussion because this is something we have been learning and practicing for a while now, even since primary school. So context, for example, you can infer the meaning out of the context. That can work, of course, and that's a good recommendation, of course. Um, but the thing is, what if most of the words are unknown? And this is when we get to the situation of estoy tan perdido que no sé qué es lo que no sé o que no entiendo qué es lo que no entiendo. This is like, okay, I don't understand the word, so I'm resorting, I'm using the context, or I'm trying to use the context to get the information, but it's like I don't even understand the context, the in-text context, because we have two different kinds of context there, but this is not something we will be discussing today. That's like a more specific discussion. So yeah, this is a very common issue. The lack of motivation or relevance. And if you're thinking these two might be connected, yes, of course. If you don't even understand the words, how can you consider that to be a relevant text? This is what happens when somebody's talking to you about a topic you don't really know anything about, and you just you just disconnect. You take your mind leaves the conversation. Or direct lack of motivation when, for instance, a very common situation, students don't really have any kind of preference. They just reading doesn't exist for them. Maybe using these words is kind of harsh, but it truly happens. And the more you teach, especially in today's world, the more you see more and more people don't like reading. No, they don't have experience. They might have read something in high school, but it's like it never happened. And just yesterday, I was in a conversation with somebody telling me about, uh, a teacher asking this kind of class, of course, hey, do you like reading? If so, what kind of things you like to read? What kind of texts? No answers from the students. Um, Only one raised her hand and said she asked if social media was an option. And that's the world we're living in nowadays. We have another example. The contextual factor is important because we have a tropical climate throughout the year, so you want to do many things actively, and reading is mainly a practice in the literacy world. Yes, this is like when we were, I think it was 2 days ago, when we mentioned how natural each one of the four skills can be. Of course, listening is the natural skill, and we said speaking is developed more naturally. And this is why instead of saying first language learning, we talk about first language acquisition because that's a more natural process. But we talk about reading, we are already talking about artificial elements that have been developed throughout the years. Um, so yeah, it can be it can be get really boring really quickly. Overemphasis on the coding, what I said a few minutes back. Uh, the coding is a factor, and probably this is a conversation Maria Zambrano has been a part of many times because in the US there is a big debate on literacy. Uh, many people try to determine or to make one more important than the other. The ability of decoding the system, the written code. Um, but then what about the transition from just decoding to actually understanding? And as we saw with speaking yesterday, there is a difference between what is being said and what is actually being said. We know connotation, we know extra linguistic elements can really change the message. And the same happens with reading. We don't have the same type of extra linguistic elements, but context is very important in even our part, the context, which is our background, our emotions, and these are important in determining how we understand a text, which of course goes beyond decoding, just decoding, sorry. This is, but we are not saying that's not important. Of course, that's the basis. This is why we are mentioning as a challenge over emphasis, not that we shouldn't give importance to it, of course. Tasks that do not match proficiency. So we're talking about making cognitively challenging, but not too much. We always go back to the I+1 hypothesis by Krashen. Um, then another uh, very common issue, we have talked about this since day one, anxiety or fear of failure. Um, Probably the most critical one regarding this is speaking, which we discussed yesterday, but this is something that affects everything, even listening. If you are very tense, if you are too anxious, probably you're not even getting the information you are being told or the information you're reading. You're just, when your mind is kind of out of control and it's so hard to concentrate, or you're trying to concentrate there, but you say these words are meaningless because you're not there mentally speaking. And for scaffolding, this is our fault. When we don't give them the necessary support or scaffolds, or when they don't really know what's the point of reading the given text, especially if, again, this is a classroom activity with students who don't really like to read, because those who like reading maybe can just read the text as they always do, and they get an idea out of the text, and they can join discussions, for example, or trying to summarize the text. But what about the rest? And the rest of them is a majority, usually. And yes, I would say always. Um, do you think there is anything else that can be causing issues here that may be an obstacle in reading uh, exercises or in developing reading skills? Well, if you do, please type it in the chat, and we can continue then with, well, we talked about challenges, of course. Next part is how to overcome these challenges, of course. We're talking about strategies for teaching reading skills. I will repeat myself one more time by telling you to remember this is a list, a summarized set of points, but if you want, you can probably expand the list, or you can even go back to your classes as a learner, as a teacher, and say, okay, I remember a teacher did this, and it was very good, or it was very effective, and so on. So, but here, right now, we are dividing the strategies into three categories, or let's say moments regarding reading. Uh, of course, the first one is before reading. What to do before reading? Well, activate and prepare learners to enter the text. Um, if you consider Maria Adam's example in the chat, this is something that probably failed in that particular situation. First thing, building background knowledge. Build background knowledge. This is one of the foundations of constructivism, right? The constructivist approach to learning that is closely connected with CLT, with communicative language teaching. This means you are ready to build new knowledge when you have the foundation of your previous knowledge, when you can make connections to build new things or to understand new concepts. If you think about it, this is also connected to I+1. I'm challenging you, but to a level you can reach based on your previous skill. That's the importance of background knowledge, or building on the student's background knowledge. Another one that probably failed in the example we're using here to guide our discussion is the fact that there was no pre-teaching, of key vocabulary. The teacher apparently, and this happens, we make mistakes again, as I always say. Maybe there wasn't time, maybe he just forgot about it, but he didn't think about the importance of actually understanding keywords that in the end, or at the end, they are the ones who allow you to understand the content. Set a clear purpose for the reading. And this is probably a tension we have in, especially talking about college, that in many cases, we are given a text and we don't really know what's going to happen with the text, or what's going to happen with us after reading the text. He's like, okay, study it. Um, all right, but what's the point? What should I pay attention to? Or what will we do afterwards? Uh, I can give you an example to show you, of course, that in telling this in advance is not necessarily, or doesn't guarantee any kind of success. But I remember a professor from ULA, of course, as an undergrad student, uh, he told us to read this certain book by Immanuel Kant and said, memorize the book. I said, like, what? What do you mean we are supposed to memorize this? He said, yes, memory is a very important cognitive skill. And well, I agree. Well, that back then, not so much. But then I said, okay, yes, memorization is important. But what about it? And he said, no, the thing is, first, memorization is important. And then after you memorize the text, we will have a test. We will have an oral assessment in groups. he even gave us the format of the assessment. I said, like, okay, so maybe this is not the best example, but at least we were mentally and emotionally prepared to what was coming after the text. Probably he was that explicit about it. He was so straightforward because uh, that was the only material we would read during the semester. We would have two exams. We would have the first exam for the first half of the book and the second exam for the second half of the book, using the same format and everything. Uh, so again, I repeat, this might not be the best example, but at least he gave us in the middle of a weird approach to his class. Um, he gave us guidance in a way. He told us, he gave us a purpose. And as in many other things in life, when you have a clear purpose, it is easier to define a course of action and strategies and everything else. What else can we do before reading? Predict content. You know, the typical questions we ask to activate curiosity, to motivate them maybe to look for information in advance. Um, Predict content from title and images, maybe not necessarily questions, but this is probably those of you who have worked with children. This is essential. I really like working with children, but you can. This is something that is even for moms. I think it becomes natural in many cases when you see, oh, what do you see here? Oh, there's a boy, and what is the boy doing? And blah blah blah. So, what do you think the story will be about? That's great for activating previous knowledge. Um, and you are not setting a clear purpose because probably in those cases that's not like very academic, even though that's an academic context. And this is working on attention, motivation, curiosity, and they can take you to places. Connect to learners' lives or interests, and this is something I have seen also with moms and teachers, especially working with younger learners. When they connected, like, "Oh, do you remember the time we went to the beach? What did we do there? Also, what is the boy here doing?" Those are great. And as I always say, trying to adapt this kind of thinking and practices to adult learners is probably a challenge, but also when it happens, it's beneficial for them because things become more meaningful. Um, that's for pre-reading. You can imagine we are headed to during the reading. During reading, what do we do? Giving our support, giving our guidance, so supporting and guiding learners as they make meaning. So the first part usually or basically is about activating their curiosity and their previous knowledge and giving them a purpose. So again, we are not in that situation when the professor tells us you need to study from unit 1 to unit 6 of the book, and then we will have an exam. Okay, but what is the exam about? What should we pay attention to? And this is not about being a lazy reader. This is about you making a more effective use of our energies, attention, even time. Because I'm thinking about, I don't know, medicine school, and these kind of situations where they just want you to read a whole bunch of things and you just become a memorization machine. What about making it meaningful? So you can have people who, technically speaking or theoretically speaking, have all the knowledge, but in the end, that's not actually operational knowledge. It's just a lot of information stored there. And then this is why even before the Bolivarian curriculum, I remember planning when I was in primary school, planning included the three objectives. Teníamos objetivos conceptuales, procedimentales y actitudinales. Uh, that was 30 years ago, but you consider that and say, yes, of course, because you can know the theory, but that doesn't mean you can actually execute or perform an activity um, or or that doesn't determine if you have the correct attitude while you are performing the activity or in the middle of the learning process. So during the reading, supporting and guiding learners includes, for instance, model think alouds. Again, this with adults maybe sounds weird, but with children, that's a common practice. Let them say or express what they are feeling and thinking while they are reading. You can have the discussion in the middle of reading, if it's possible, of course, and use, for instance, guiding questions. Oh, this woman is so mean. And what do you mean with mean? Don't you like her? Say, no, she's always trying to sabotage. I don't know. Snow White. See, but why did you think she's doing that? And you see, this is when the word interactive is more evident. Um, because these kind of questions, maybe not the exact type of question, even when we're reading by ourselves, are the ones that make or allows are the ones that allow us to interact with the text to get a deeper understanding on what's happening, not just decoding. So yes, remember, we have said this many times. The power teachers have when they know how to ask good questions. Encourage annotation or note taking, not on the book. I mean, I used to work with books at libraries, and I completely against writing, on the pages. So I would recommend you to use a notebook or something. But if you don't have an issue with taking notes there, my dad does that all the time, which is hurtful for me. That hurts me. Um, I remember I took a course on book preservation. I don't remember many things now, but so I was being trained to fix books, but then I see people writing on them. But that's a personal choice. The important part is that note taking can really help you remember interesting facts, reinforce your understanding, and the benefits we know writing has from a cognitive perspective, especially if we are connecting that with reading. Uh, Another common recommendation, we have seen this for many different purposes. Chunk the text into manageable parts. If you set pauses, you can use the think aloud, you can use guiding questions, you can check notes while you are making a pause, and then you don't need to wait until the end of the reading to see if your student is getting what you want him to get out of the text. Um, so this is also, I think this is a good example also of the difference between summative assessment and formative assessment. This practice I'm mentioning here is basically what formative assessment looks like. You don't need to wait until the end and then decide if the student learned or didn't learn. It is better to focus on the process to know how and when uh, you can help your students to reach their goals. And the same happens the other way around if you just wait until the end and then you complain because they didn't understand anything, but they didn't have support. So if they don't have support, they have less opportunities of succeeding, of course. Then allow rereading and peer discussion. Of course, if time allows this, rereading is, I think, something we have all done in the past, not just when you don't understand, but because in many cases, what we get from the initial reading will change after reading the text for a second time or even a third time. And you really get a different understanding. You get things probably you had missed in the previous one. And that's always a good recommendation, rereading the text, even in the classroom. If you have a reading activity, uh, if time allows and it makes sense for the lesson, I would recommend you to read the text more than once. Um, I think probably the more advanced the level is, the better this practice can be. And peer discussion, remember, if you are not willing to share because you are anxious or you're not really confident at the moment, you can just share it with your peer first and then you can share it with the rest, the typical think, per, share activity, right? So what do we have left? You can imagine that we have after reading. After reading, we have helping learners reflect, connect, and extend understanding. For instance, by summarizing or retell the story, we were already mentioning conversation there with peers. You can ask them to summarize the story, to retell the story, to compare their notes if they had any, discuss interpretations, what they got from the text, what they didn't get, because their interpretations can be very different because that interpretation depends on background knowledge, uh, previous information they had, the way they interacted with the text, depending on the questions. For example, we gave them for that purpose, personalize the response. This is, well, even in interviews, I remember, what would you do if, or if you were that character, what would you have done differently? It depends on the level, of course, but you get the idea, I'm guessing. Graphic organizers or visual mapping. Uh, the typical joke I have heard on this is relates with 100 años de soledad, 100 years solitude. And we say, okay, I'm asking my students to write or to draw the Buendia's family tree. You say, oh my goodness. So handle with care, basically. That's what I'm saying here. That's our choice, depending on the specific situation, context. Remember the importance, I keep repeating myself, the importance of asking open-ended questions. Uh, if you had to choose between what would you do as a question and did you like it? I think if you are trying to have a conversation on the text they just read, what would you do is more it's more likely to lead to that conversation. I'm not saying that did you like it is not an option, but if you are asking only that, is like, did you like it? Yes. Okay, moving on, and then you move on to something else. That's not what we are trying here. We are trying to use reading to give space to communication, right? In the end, also always CLT. All right. Uh, so we finally have connect to writing or speaking tasks. Well, as once again, sequencing, integrated skills. So we make it or we transform that reading into an integrated skills activity. All right. This is leading us now to something key here, which is using authentic materials. Uh, what makes a material authentic? The fact that it is created as such. They are created for real world purposes, not for language teaching. I'm not saying that adaptations are bad. Actually, at Sevam, we have used many times. Probably the resource is there. This adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's, or some of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, it has the murders in the whole marsh. It has, I think it has the Telltale Heart and some others. But what's the point? That these are adaptations, but these are good adaptations. If we have read the original text by Poe, we have probably noticed the particular use of vocabulary he has. And it's probably not an excellent choice for someone who's beginning their language journey. But these adaptations are very good. So I am not saying that only original texts are good, but then uh, you are the ones judging the quality of the text, okay? But in general, real world purpose text created with a real world purpose are tend to be better because they're authentic. That's the thing, right? Uh, and since they're authentic, they were created for a real purpose. The use of language is natural; it is not forced. So natural language in the use, the context, and the audience. Okay. Some examples: news articles, blog posts, menus, short stories, emails. All of them are good according to what you are trying to teach or what you are trying your students to learn. Uh, this is very, very beneficial, of course. This boosts learner motivation and curiosity and exposes learners to real language, including the tone, idioms, structure, even mentioning here. metalinguistic awareness. Once again, they can even reflect on the language here, the use of the language. Uh, and well, this of course has to do with them understanding and maybe be starting to use different genres. It also, the use of authentic materials also encourages critical thinking and interpretation based on, for example, real opinions uh, written by real people on real issues. Um, and it builds transferable skills for life outside the classroom. Well, critical thinking is probably the most important one of them. When the student practices this at Sebam is good for everybody. For them as English language for learners, for them as people living in a complex context, and for them as human beings. And for us, of course, because we're winning here, we are helping them in more than one way as a consequence. Um, Remember, Seman más que inglés. Some challenges, however, there are challenges to consider when you are choosing your authentic materials. Be careful with their complexity, both from a linguistic perspective and a cultural perspective. Uh, Once again, this is, I think in the past we used the word curator when we were talking about our role as teachers, depending on the approach. Here, you see, this is one of them. This is something you can frame in project-based learning, for instance. If you are in a project and you are the one providing them the materials they are expected to use, this is when you are in charge of choosing the right text, especially in this particular aspect. Uh, I plus one again, cognitive demand to make it appropriate for them, but not only from a linguistic perspective, but also cultural. If they want to have a debate on the word, that's a sensitive thing, but on the what's happening in Iran right now, uh, it is a sensitive and complex topic in itself. So having students debating this, um, you really need to consider what they need to know from a cultural and a linguistic perspective, probably the cultural side. Um, and this is something that should be reflected on the text you choose. Probably you're thinking of something being digestible, if you want, something they can actually understand, and then see if they are comfortable with the content and so on. And what I'm saying here is basically scaffolding. Again, authentic materials can be challenging, not that challenge, the challenge itself is negative. We are trying to challenge our students um, after all, but we need to give them the support to, to overcome the challenge. Uh, this also requires clear task design, clear goals, clear instructions, clear procedures. Another challenge to consider here when using authentic materials is the risk of overwhelming learners if not adapted or supported. This is basically what I have been saying for a while now. Um, in terms of course, what we said here on the complexity and also the fact that adapted materials, oh my God, I'm horrible today. Adapted materials are not necessarily bad, but you are the one who should know and then make an informed decision. These materials need careful assignment with learner levels and goals. I think this is already clear. And the why it matters probably is also clear right now. They connect reading to life in the end. Or after all, we're talking about reading activities, life, identity, and agency. This is super important in reading because this is an individual thing that helps them build their own decisions based on their own judgment. That's their interpretation connected to the way they see the world. And therefore, this is building their agency and their identity, both linguistic and non-linguistic identity. Also, because they have learners see themselves as real readers. You see, reading is not just decoding. So when the student gets out of the text and is able to use it, that's meaningful. So you're a reader. You're not just a learner completing a task because the teacher told you to do so. No, you're a person who actually is competent and can get out of this situation. Uh, so this takes us to what reading means to us. I'm speaking here on behalf of Sebam. I didn't ask for permission, but I think this is what this section, because we're finishing the reading section, it was probably kind of at some point going over and over certain points, but that's part of creating the habit. Uh, so I think this is summarized here. It was very effective, 1 hour. What reading means to us. So first, I have to say that authentic materials help learners experience reading as something real. This is literally the last point I discussed in the previous slide. Reading is supposed to be real, not just academic. If learners understand this, we have more chances of succeeding. So authenticity works when we support learners, not when we overwhelm them. There is a big difference between challenging them uh, and just overwhelming them. Overwhelming is never good. Um, then we should consider that as a man, reading to us is not just a skill, it is a way of seeing. So when we teach reading, we don't just help learners decode words. That's something that can be accomplished and probably is accomplished at early stages. We are here trying to help them understand the meaning behind those words. Okay, we help them, as a consequence, decode the world, not just a bunch of symbols on a piece of paper. Um, I was skipping here. I will ask you before continuing. What do you think about all of this we have discussed so far on reading? What do you think about the experiences you had and you shared before after all of this conversation? Does anybody have a comment before we move on?
Hi, Amber. It's Maria Virginia. I just wanted to say that so far it's all been really good information. I'm understanding the strategies. It's somewhat similar to what I've been using, especially with the teenagers group. And it's interesting because with them, I've been going over this theme kind of. I've been telling them that when they read, we need to focus, like, we need to start focusing on the meaning of the words because they're now at a level where more so than the meaning of the words, the meaning of the sentence, because we are at a level where we can put together a sentence. So, for example, a lot of students have this thing where they can read and understand the words like one by one and they can like, okay, so this means this, but once they have to put the whole sentence together, that can that sometimes makes them confused. So I've been telling them like that happens because you are going word by word, finding the meaning of the word, but not stringing it together, like not building sort of a narrative from it, not noticing the narrative that is within the text. So you have to start paying attention to that. That's what I've been telling them. And we've been working it by reading, a text like sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, I mean, in a sentence.
Yes, thank you, Maria Virginia. And this is what we somehow mentioned before when I said Maria Alejandra had this experience in the US. And what you're mentioning is a part of the discussion in literacy, in terms of literacy in American schools, when decoding is the center of attention and the consequences and how to overcome that. Um, because it's sometimes even when we're talking about how to assess if the student is ready, if you are teaching them to decode words, but then the assessment asks about interpretation or main ideas or something like this, that's not valid assessment. You are not assessing in a fair way because they don't really have a chance. If they are just decoding words, how do you expect them to produce, complex ideas or have complex interpretations? So yeah, and this is also why something we see in the progress of the program, when you go in book one from repeating nationalities or identifying adjectives to build sentences. So yeah, thank you, Maria. Verena has a comment here. I was able to hear about possible. Okay. Yes, yes, yes. So bottom line, thank you, Verena. Thank you, Maria. We are now headed to the next section. Um, as Maria Virginia said, we're approaching this section, teaching reading in EFL classroom, basically with a premise. The premise is reading is more than decoding, and we should teach it with this in mind. What I mentioned in the previous slide, what reading means to us, especially. And if you go, even you can go over the structure at Sevam. And our executive director is a big reader. She is really into reading. I wish I had her motivation and energy when it comes to reading. Miguel is also a reader. I wouldn't consider myself a big reader, but I do like reading. And you can even think about yourselves because while teaching adults, even children of a certain proficiency level, you can even push yourself to read by encouraging your students to read because you need to read to know the options you have, for instance. Um, okay, so let's move on because now we're talking about writing. In a similar way to what we have in the past, at the beginning of today, I'm asking you here to start with your own experience. This is not focusing on the negative. This is a little more general. It says there, what has writing meant to you as a student and now as a teacher? So I have a few questions here. Did you enjoy writing growing up while you were growing up? Why? Why yes or why no? You can say, no, I didn't like writing. Um, how do you feel about teaching writing now? Maybe the question seems kind of silly, but I can guarantee you, because this is based on evidence, many teachers do not like teaching writing, okay? And there are reasons. And I think the first reason is a bit obvious. Well, the first two reasons, but we will get there. But how do you feel about teaching writing now? This has many possible answers. You can say, well, I don't feel confident, for example, or I feel like I don't have the necessary tools to do it effectively. You have many possible answers. What kinds of writing would you like your students to do? Be careful here because this is directly asking for your opinion. What kinds of writing would you like your students to do and why? You can tell me this truly depends on the group you're teaching. Yes, their proficiency level is a factor, their age is a factor, and the level itself is a factor. So yes, it has many possible answers as well. And the final question, I think that's the final one, yes. Why does writing matter in language learning? So you have here five questions, not particularly easy. Therefore, again, I'm giving you a moment there. I'm going to turn off my microphone and camera. You can share your answer in a couple of phrases if you want in the chat. Or once I open up my microphone again, you can just start speaking and giving your opinion to the rest. All right, we already have a great explanation in the chat. Is anybody else? Is there anybody else who wants to share? If not, we can continue. Okay, there's something more in the chat. Uh, mhm. Okay, okay, great. All right, I think we can continue because we already have excellent information. Those of you who haven't shared, you can keep that information or that in mind because um, I even when I was planning today's well, I was working on today's conversation, I noticed that the course is not so much about learning. Well, I do hope you are learning, of course, important things, uh, but it is more about becoming. This is more about building an identity and becoming a teacher whose practices are aligned with what's recommended nowadays in the field and what SEBAM expects from their teachers, you know, to offer the best service we can to our customers. Um, and this is something I already see reflected in Maria Virginia's comment. So this is going to be quick because Maria said it all. uh, why it matters. The last question was why is it important to teach writing in language learning, in our particular case, in EFL contexts. As Maria Virginia said, writing in general has benefits, okay? It helps you organize your ideas, it helps you, well, learn or access to information, it helps you develop a certain awareness on the language. So, yeah, writing in general is beneficial. It truly is beneficial. So and this is why I didn't want to dive deeper or to discuss further details on the why from a general perspective, but to make it more specific to our context, which is an EFL context in Venezuela, particularly at CEBAM. Um, yes, I consider myself an average student right at school. Uh-huh. Okay. Yes, yes. I can barely say things you haven't mentioned now that I see Maria Alejandra's comment. Um, so this is going to be faster than expected. So first, as CFL teachers, we should remember that writing reinforces other skills. It helps learners internalize grammar, vocabulary, and syntax through active use. And this is very important, okay? This is very significant for us. First, we're talking about active use, we're talking about active learning, we're talking about hands-on learning that is, of course, way more meaningful than you just writing just because, or using grammar as an end in itself. Writing gives you a space to make all of this part of one in a more meaningful way. It encourages form-focused attention, which in today's world is a huge deal after the consequences of TikTok and social media in general, talking about Snapchat or Instagram, even YouTube Shorts are contributing to the lack of focusing on many of us. So this is kind of an alternative. Learners notice and correct errors more consciously than in speech. So instead of them just wanting to go to the next activity, this is something that takes time. It requires attention and probably this can help students notice and correct errors. Of course, this is not something that's going to happen out of nowhere. This requires guidance, but that's okay, right? That's part of our job. Uh, and even talking about that happening in speech, yesterday, remember, we talked about recasting the students to give students oral feedback or a corrected feedback. And we said that sometimes recasting the downside of, or we said, I'm sorry, I'm horrible today. I don't know if I'm tired or I'm still internally celebrating Venezuela's championship. So I'm sorry, but the important part here is that we were talking about the downside of recasting to give or when giving or corrective feedback. And one downside, something that happens frequently, is that the correction goes unnoticed. The student doesn't see that the teacher is actually correcting the statement. In writing, the situation is different because it takes more time and space. If we are using corrections effectively or we are giving specific, targeted, good feedback, probably this awareness is better built in writing, especially in low input environments, which happens a lot in EFL settings. Writing becomes a key space for language rehearsal. Um, so it's exposure, basically. Particularly because when you are writing, you shouldn't at least just write it and submit it. Usually you expect or you would prefer the students have the normal or have the necessary time to go over their product to see uh, if it is appropriate for their requirements according to the required format, for instance. Um, Writing also in EFR context builds discourse awareness. You see, this is going to develop a little bit what we were mentioning before. They begin to understand text structure, cohesion, and genre conventions in a more practical way, something that Maria Virginia mentioned in her comment. Uh, Very good. It was a very good way to put it into words. Um, we talked about genres before cohesion and probably more or better, and this is something I'm talking about based on my own experience, the mistakes I have made in the past. It is better if they read, remember sequencing, they analyze, and then they start trying things in their writing than giving them a list of cohesive devices. You know, the big name, of course, that sounds great. And those students who are in academic fields or are interested in building that kind of speech find it interesting. But the truth is that most learners are not like that. And then that can be intimidating or overwhelming. And you end up in the same situation as when you give your students a list of 100 verbs in level one and you tell them to memorize them. And then that doesn't become or that doesn't translate into an operational kind of knowledge. Um, Next, we have writing tasks, expose them to real world formats, kind of the same situation, but with more detail here at the same point. If you want them to know how to write an email, it is a good idea to show them how emails are written. Of course, we're talking about emails like structured, serious, professional emails, especially because this tends to be difficult because this is one of those things they don't learn in their first language. I don't really think many teachers in Venezuelan high schools tell students or teach students how to write an email using a professional tone, for instance. So at Sevan there, this is one more of those situations we have seen in which we are uh, kind of building from scratch the skill. The same with reports, narratives, reflections. What we said with speaking yesterday as well, they are not taught in Venezuela, students, I mean, or we, because I was there as well, I'm a product of the Venezuelan education system. They don't really teach us how to talk about ourselves, for example, how to describe our skills, how to write a letter, like really, like in Venezuela, for example, very common letter, a very common type of letter, exposición de motivos. Uh, and I remember many, many times in college when I was student at UPEL, it was we were frequently put into situations where we needed to write that kind of letter, and most students didn't have a clue. Um, so what's about this is a double purpose. We need to teach them, we need to expose them to this text, and then we are doubling the benefit they get from this when they learn how to write these in no, I'm sorry, remember my name. These kind of writing. Also, writing supports reading comprehension. As I was just mentioning, this is a back and forth process. And this is the same that happened with listening and speaking, right? We said listening and speaking, partners in communication. Well, the same happens here with writing, reading and writing. Usually they reinforce each other. They are supposed to even read their own texts and try to use their critical thinking to determine if the text accomplishes whatever it is supposed to accomplish. Um, Writing in infield context, why it matters, we have a little more here. Then it supports fluency and confidence, uh, especially compared to speaking, because writing gives learners time to think, which tends to reduce performance pressure. Um, so yeah, when you're speaking, you are expected to produce an immediate answer, but in writing, the situation is different. So even if you don't really know how to start your text, if the teacher is there supporting you, you are overcoming a big obstacle, a big challenge. It also allows for revision and reflection, which builds confidence over time. Meanwhile, they are also working on their uh, metalinguistic awareness, right? This awareness of their strengths, their challenges. And you know, when students, when learners reach this certain point, when they are speaking or writing, and without our participation or guidance, they can see their own mistakes. That's a big step forward in their learning journey when they can correct themselves. In context with limited speaking opportunities, writing can be a primary mode of expression. I think there's no need to explain that. And what we should keep in mind, I think we're about to finish. Oh, we're exactly on time. Um, it really requires scaffolding and relevance. Writing, because of different reasons, we will dive deeper into this tomorrow, can be particularly challenging. And probably the most obvious one is something that Alejandra mentioned there, and it is the lack of a habit. I said we are not taught, or we are not usually taught to talk about ourselves, but I think that's more serious, of course. Uh, we are not taught to develop, or we are not guided to develop writing as a habit, as an everyday activity, or as something that is actually useful. Uh, so we have this kind of rejection, or many students have this sense of, I don't like writing. I don't want to write. And now that I mentioned Javier earlier in the class. Javier teaches, or he's usually teaching the last level in the adult courses. So this is the last thing we have at Sevam. Well, we might mention the TOEFL course, but in the actual program, the regular program, we have level 10, or the advanced integrated course. You can imagine that if this student started, if this happens, a student who was there for the children courses, then for the teenage courses, young adults, and adult courses, these guys are usually the ones with better proficiency, but even them have told Javier in a class like they don't want to write, they don't see the point in writing. And the worst part is when you listen to these people who are supposed to be very proficient learners, seem to be struggling with certain things that you as a teacher know could benefit from writing. You know, like you say, okay, you are not structuring your ideas, your vocabulary is very basic. If you started reading more and writing more, probably you would overcome this. But then there is this rejection. this negative feeling towards writing. And that makes scaffolding and making it relevant more important. Um, so EFL learners often face limited exposure to authentic models, cultural mismatches in genre or tone, or anxiety about correctness and evaluation. Therefore, writing instructions should include the following scaffold. It should be scaffolded with models, prompts, feedback, not waiting till the end, right? This is like reading. You can follow the process, guide the process, and provide feedback before they produce something you end up saying is horrible. Uh, you, of course, you wouldn't say that, or you shouldn't say that's horrible, but maybe you think that. You say, okay, this is horrible. But it's on you to avoid that situation at the end. So think of the right prompts, give them the right models, let them analyze, let them a chance, give them a chance of, to analyze the models, the prompts, to see if they really understand the prompt, if they really understand what's expected, and give them specific targeted feedback. Um, Interestingly, I think of this example of a professor from UMD talking about his time in China writing. Well, he was working there, and he said that the first time he needed to write a composition, he wrote it in the American way, which is the one we use. And he said that the Chinese professors who read his composition were kind of upset, were kind of uncomfortable because they didn't understand. And this is what he told us. He didn't understand why the text was so explicit in the sense of everything is explained. And he said that that over there, they don't expect text to be written like this. And we follow the American model. Remember, we said topic sentence, supporting sentences, details for the supporting sentences, and whatever. He said that these professors uh, told him something like he was showing or implying that they were stupid because he's denying them the opportunity to understand the text by themselves. Um, and this is why I mean what I'm referring to here is the possibility of cultural mismatches. And of course, this reinforces the importance of modeling, uh, giving them the time and space to understand the genre they are writing or the nature, the features of the specific text. Um, Something relevant, connected to the learner's lives, goals, and interest. This is a permanent premise in everything we do. And to make it safe, also something we mentioned yesterday about psychological safety, to make it emotionally and cognitively safe, to encourage risk taking. So the students feel they're welcome, the students feel like they can ask questions, they can make their contributions, and even challenge whatever is happening in the activity. Maybe to say, why am I writing like this and not the other way around, and blah, 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 blah. That's good because that means they feel safe enough to share their opinions. Of course, in a polite way. It's one that is productive. Not we are not talking about here about a spoiled student who doesn't want to do anything. We are talking here about a mature comment coming from a person with awareness and an interest in the language. So we're going to finish here. Yeah, we're exactly on time. We're perfectly here. Writing is a way of thinking aloud, but on paper, of course. A mirror of language, thought, and identity. Or writing is a tool for learning, not just a product of learning. Hmm. You can also say that writing is a space where learners take risks, make meaning, and find their voice when we promote their agency and identity. Uh, Writing is both process and product. It is messy, recursive, and transformative. Writing is affective, shaped by emotions, past experiences, and the presence or absence of psychological safety. So there you have seven or seven, no, six, seven. We have six possible definitions, very short definitions for writing. I'm going to leave you with this very short reflection, okay? Which of these definitions resonates with you? You don't have to share anything, okay? This is just for you to close the day. Which of these definitions resonates with you? How do you think your students could experience writing more meaningfully? And what might help reduce anxiety or build confidence in your writing sections? As I said, this is not for you to give me an answer. This is for your reflection. Uh, what do you think writing is? Okay, this is again to finish the day. Maybe for you it's a tool for learning, but it is also affective, shaped by emotions. So I'm gonna make a pause here for you to read them, internalize them. And for those of you guys watching the video, same for you, make a pause, consider the questions. Then it's time to finish for today, okay? But that's not the end of everything because we will continue tomorrow.